Hello fellas, welcome to the first episode of our new adventure. Today we are going to start building this. A 1/48 scale B-26B-50 Invader from ICM. In this series we are going to have a lot of scratch building, some aftermarket detail installation and a lot of fun. So, let's get started. The pilot's control pedestal, or the central console for short, is quite a prominent feature in the cockpit. Unfortunately, it is quite plain in its out-of-the-box format, so we'll have to take care of that, but after we finish the assembly. Throughout this kit we can find such mating surfaces that are at a 45-degree angle. In theory that should work great, but there is some room for improvements, so a little bit of Tamiya putty had to be employed to fix the shortcomings. The representation of the levers on the throttle quadrant is miserable, so those have to go, along with the plastic in the slots where the actual levers move. I started them using a mini saw and then refined the openings with microfiles. In some places I had to use drill bits and a scalpel to open up the slots. To create the actual levers, I use appropriately sized leftover pieces from photo etch threads, which were bent in half, and then I inserted a plastic disc in the base. For the handles I used small sections of stretch sprue, which were then superglued to the levers. Next thing to do is to attach the levers in their position using CA glue. Quite a finicky job, and to be fair, I'm not sure all of these levers will survive till the end, but it looks good, nice and busy. Before we get to the next stage of detailing, I will glue the central console to the cockpit floor. Now let's turn our attention to the rearmost deck, where we will build a fire extinguisher assembly. First, I fabricated a couple of brackets and a cradle out of thin aluminum sheet. For the vessel I used part of a 1/72 scale anti-tank rocket, which I shaped appropriately, and then drilled a hole to accommodate the neck, which is a section of stretch sprue. I did not have anything suitable for the nozzle, so I made one from 2-part epoxy putty. My abilities as a sculptor are very limited, so it is what it is. There are many details I don't know the purpose of or their names, but since they are in the reference pictures, they have to be made. Such is the case with those cylindrical objects. I made them from spruce using my Dremel tool as a lathe. Later I read that those are relief containers. Next up is a small controller which is called interphone jack box, and I made it out of plastic art and a round rod section. Easy. After a bracket on the top shelf, it is time to install the hydraulic hand pump handle, and then I added a couple of hydraulic lines made of soldering wire. When working with soldering wire, it is important to be very careful, as it is very easy to damage it. On the other hand, this softness is very beneficial when it comes to routing. And finally, in this area we have to do a wiring loom. The issue here is that the loom has to go behind the hand pump handle, which it cannot do. So I split it in 2 sections, which will go both ways from the handle. My wire looms are quite simplistic and look more like tank ropes, probably because there are twisted wire strands, but I'm sure it's gonna be okay. At the end, that's towards the rear bulkhead, I split the wire loom in 2. One part will seemingly go through the bulkhead, and the other one is going towards the interphone jack box we made earlier. And with that out of the way, the central console is done, and it looks pretty decent, methinks. Now let's move on to the instrument panel. It is pretty good out of the box, but lacks the overhang on the top. So I'm going to add that using thin sheet of plastic. The overall shape is quite simple, so after a little bit of trimming, the overhang can be glued on. After the glue sets, we can trim the thing even further. Another detail that can be added are some sort of fasteners on top of the dashboard. To add those, I drilled a few indentations which will accommodate the fasteners later on. Before I can glue those, I added a wall that will give the cockpit more depth, because otherwise it all just ends after the dashboard, which seems unlikely to me. Now we can carefully place small discs cut from stress sprue inside the indentations we drilled earlier, and this should be just fine for the fastener details. The cockpit floor is quite basic. On the starboard side it is essentially flat. That's why I'm going to recreate a plate and some other details that I can see on the reference images. The plate has a hump on the real aircraft, but it is right underneath the seat and I see no point putting the effort. So I shaped a piece of sheet plastic and it is time to glue it to the floor. Before I add anything else, I will add a couple of rivet lines. Since the cockpit floor is a ceiling of the nose gear bay, I suspect that those rivet lines are for the gear bay walls, or at least it looks that way. Next, I will add a few more plates to give the floor more busy appearance. Those are going to make nobody's head spinning, but oftentimes the simplest things make a big difference. I decided to make the joint between the yoke and the control column a bit sturdier. So I drilled a hole in each of them, then I inserted a paper clip section in the yoke. On the control column there is a dial of sorts, and apparently a cable that feeds it with something. So naturally I had to make this cable. A couple of holes, a 0.3mm soldering wire and some super glue were enough to get the job done. First things first, let's glue together the radio equipment rack. The assembly is by no means hard, but to be fair, it takes some guesswork as far as angles go. The faces of the equipment are adequately detailed, and this area will require the least work as far as detailing goes. One of the things I would like to achieve is to give this box more presentable appearance. So I scribed a panel line more or less in the middle of it. This small channel is where the door hinge will be, and the hinge is a piece of stretch sprue. To outline the lid, I scribed some more lines on the sides and on the top of the box. For the piano hinge effect, I made lots of cuts on the sprue. It's best if the cuts are equally spaced and contained in the sprue, but this world is not perfect. Next I shaped a small piece of sheet plastic so it reminds of a strap that holds the lid closed. I also put a button on the strap, but that disappeared somehow. The bulkhead is a big mess. It looks like spaghetti carbonara. So much stuff. Obviously I'm not going to even try to replicate this madness in its full glory. I want to retain some sanity after all is said and done. Instead, I am creating a simplified version that should carry some resemblance with the real situation. To do that, I selected a few pipes and cables that I could trace with some confidence. To make my life easier, I drilled holes to insert the pipes whenever this was possible. Again, some finesse is required when bending the soldering wire due to its softness. You can see that I managed to do some damage on some of the pipes, but it remains to be seen how apparent this will be when all is done. I also made the hydraulic pressure accumulators from Tamiya 2-part epoxy putty, and a small bracket for them using some sheet plastic. You probably noticed that I am not following any particular order in adding the details. I add a pipe, then I built a gauge housing, then more pipes and cables. The simple reason is that the layout is rather overwhelming, and probably it was a poor decision not to do a plan but rather build stuff on the fly. At this point I am pretty sure that we have plenty of details to make this area look busy and interesting, but not so much that it would be a waste of time due to lack of visibility when the model is complete. In any case, we will see if such statement is true right at the end of the build. For now, let's move on to another area. The starboard sidewall also needs some attention. First, let's try and create the curtain that can be seen separating the cockpit from the nose section. After I made a base from plastic sheet, I will try to create the texture using Tamiya's 2-part epoxy putty. As you can see, I am not a sculptor and the darn thing looks more like a tree bark than a curtain, but this will have to do. After we glue the curtain in its place, it is time for some instruments and panels on the sidewall. I went through a lot of pictures. Some of restored aircraft, some were of a time period closer to the original, but there are many different layouts from what I can see. Unfortunately, I could not pinpoint the layout that is correct for the version I am building. So I choose the version that I had most confidence in the position of things, aka the best pictures. Probably the most elaborate object in this area are those two instruments for which I had to create a base. I did that using thin metal sheet. On the bottom I glued two larger sections of round rod and on the top two discs of the same rod. This way I will get the appearance of an instrument housing going through the plate. Next I glued a few panels flat on the sidewall. I will add more details on them later on. But now I'm going to recreate some of the wiring going in and out of these panels. For that I used copper wire, CA glue and lots of shaping and bending. I also employed some CA glue activator to speed up the bonding time. Although these wires are quite easy to bend, I still find it hard to bend them neatly. I guess I will have to work more on that skill, but if you have any suggestions, feel free to let me know by leaving a comment in the comment section underneath this video. For the wire looms that run on the sidewall towards the rear bulkhead, I wanted to have the appearance that the looms go underneath the ribs. So I cut the wires to fit neatly between the ribs and hopefully this will give the desired impression. Now we can add a few simple details on the sidewall panels. Once again, those will not be extremely detailed replicas of the real panels, but with some careful painting they should look pretty presentable. On the reference pictures we can see some sort of box underneath the seat. So I fabricated one from plastic and now we can glue this into position. And speaking about the seat, let's add some details on it. First I will create the hinges as this seat is foldable. Then we can add some nice seat belts on. And that's about all this seat needs, as it's not very complex to begin with, or at least compare with the pilot seat. After gluing the seat in place, we can move on to some more wiring harness building. To represent connectors, I used stretched cotton bud tubes. Too bad these plastic tubes are replaced with paper ones. I made two of these looms and one will bend to go back towards the bomb bay and the other will go down. Having those wires twisted like that undoubtedly makes it harder to bend them. And the bends become chunkier and less realistic in my opinion. I wonder if fine sewing thread will be better for recreating such details. I should do a memo on that and give it a try at some point. Next, we have a couple of pipes that apparently come from the wing and go on the ceiling towards the other wing. I can assume this is for fuel transfer, however don't quote me on that. I placed some stretched cotton bud tubing on these pipes as well. I guess those are connectors too. In my infinite wisdom, I forgot to do a continuation of these pipes on the other side of the fuselage. Luckily, this will not be noticeable after all is assembled. And with that, we can call the sidewall complete. There are absolutely no details to suggest the existence of the overhead controls. So we'll have to add something. Prior to gluing anything on the canopy though, I masked both the inside and the outside. I will leave a couple of links in the description if you are interested in canopy masking tutorials. To replicate the knobs, I cut stretch sprue to small discs which I glued directly in the plastic. If you want to get fancier, you can cut some sheet plastic and then glue the discs on it, so you get switchboard. Since the visibility towards the overhead console is very limited, I will opt for the simplified solution. In addition to that, I constructed a few levers. Actually, 2 of them were constructed. The third one was not, as it was a single piece of stretch sprue. And finally, I added more buttons, this time made out of small rectangles from sheet plastic. My friends, the cockpit is mostly done. The bomb bay and the gunner's compartment are next on the line, but we are going to deal with them next week. Or you can join me and my awesome supporters on Patreon to see how much ahead are we in this build. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this video, thank you for watching, and until next time, happy modeling fellas!